What's up, YouTube? I'm here doing my prediction video for UFC 261. Let's start at the bottom. The first fight is Na Ling versus Ariana Koren. I can't say her last name. To me, I think this is just two decent strikers going at it, and I'm leaning slightly towards Ariana. I haven't seen either of these chicks fight really, so it's hard to tell, but I'm leaning towards Ariana. Next is Quayle Ori versus Jeffrey Molina, and to me, both these guys look like they're pretty well rounded. I'm just leaning slightly towards Jeffrey. This is another fight where neither guys have fight a lot, so I haven't. It's hard for me to go in depth on these predictions for these lower fights because until we get to kind of the middle of the card, it's a lot of like first time, second time fighters in the UFC. So just letting you guys know ahead of time, it's hard for me to make talk about these guys a lot in the first few fights, but I think these guys are both pretty well rounded, but I'm just leaning slightly towards Jeffrey. I think I saw him on the Contender Series and he looked pretty solid, so I'm leaning towards Jeffrey. Next is Kazula Vargas versus Rong Zhu, and to me, Rong Zhu has looked really good. I saw his thing. He's on like a 10-fight win streak, and most of those wins are by KOs. I think both these guys are primarily strikers, and I'm just leaning towards Rong because, like I said, I think he's on a really strong KO win streak, and I think if this is just straight striking, which is how Kazula likes to fight too, I think Rong's going to win by KO. Next is Dana, I can't say his last name, versus Kevin Natividad. And to me, these are both just, they're fun exciting back and forth strikers, but I'm leaning slightly towards Kevin. I think Kevin does have slightly better wrestling if he needs to get takedowns here and there. But I think it'll be a close back and forth striking for the most part. I just think Kevin will slightly edge out the rounds and probably win a unanimous decision. Next is Patrick, I can't say his last name, versus Tristan Connolly. To me, both these guys are primarily grapplers. I think Tristan's probably the slightly better striker. I think this fight's mostly going to be grappling, though. I would say Patrick's probably the stronger wrestler, but Tristan's the better overall jiu-jitsu guy. Because of that, it makes it really close. I'm leaning ever so slightly towards Tristan just because I do think he's got the better striking and overall better grappling. Patrick could probably just lay on him and grind out a decision. That's a huge possibility, but I'm just leaning slightly towards Tristan to either catch him or submit him, just because, like I said, I think he's a little bit more well-rounded in both those areas. Next is Carl Robinson versus Brendan Allen. And this is going to be straight up striker versus grappler. I think that Carl Robinson has a huge advantage in the striking. I think Brendan Allen has a huge advantage in the grappling. My biggest thing is I think Brendan Allen kind of learned from his last fight. His striking is getting better, but he's still primarily a jiu-jitsu guy. I think he just needs to focus on trying to get this fight to the ground. And one thing we've seen from Carl Robinson is if you can pressure him, he does tend to gas. I think that he has a hard time making middleweight. I don't think his cardio holds up phenomenally well when you push him, and I think that even though he's a better striker, as long as Allen's safe when he presses forward, he should be able to get the fight to the ground eventually, and once he does, I think he's going to win by submission. So, like I said, other than him getting caught with a huge shot, I think Allen eventually wears down Robinson and wins by submission. Next is Dwight Grant versus Steven, I can't say his last name. I think that these guys are both primarily strikers. I think Steven definitely has the better overall ground game, but I think Dwight has too good takedown defense for that to even happen. I think this is going to be a back and forth kickboxing fight, and I just think Dwight has the faster hands and heavier shots. I think that's just the best way to put it. Is their striking technique's probably close, but like I said, Dwight's hand speed and punching power is just a lot better, and because of that, I'm leaning towards him to win by KO. My one and only fear with Dwight is sometimes he has these slow kickboxing matches where nothing happens. And if that happens, he can always lose a close decision. He just needs to be active. As long as Dwight is active with his hands, I think he can win this fight by knockout. Like I said, I think he's the better striker in terms of speed and punching power. So yeah, I'm picking Dwight to win by probably first or second round KO. Next is Alexander Oliveira versus Randy Brown. And to me, this fight entirely depends on Oliveira. I think in terms of overall skill, they're pretty close, but I think Oliveira just hits a lot harder and has better striking technique. I think his biggest problem is he tends to waste a lot of energy early, and then that kind of fucks him over later in the fight. I think as long as Oliveira paces himself in a lot of fights, kind of like how Justin Gaethje's doing nowadays, he can beat a lot of these mid-tier guys. I mean, he was ranked in the top 15 at one point in time, and I don't think his skills have diminished. I think it's just an energy thing. If he can conserve his energy, he can beat most of these mid-tier guys. I think Randy Brown is a really good mid-tier guy, and he is starting to come up, and I think this fight's going to be close. I just think, like I said, for me, it's largely about Oliveira. Can he pace himself well enough? Because Randy Brown's not going to get tired unless he's getting fucked up. Like, Randy Brown's never gotten really tired unless he's taking a ton of damage. In the fights where it's just, normally paced and both guys are doing the same amount of damage to each other, he's usually got the better conditioning. So, like I said, it's tough because I do think overall consistency-wise, Randy Brown's probably better. But I just think overall skill-wise, Oliveira's better. It's just he needs to pace himself, and I think if he does that, Oliveira wins. So I'm leaning towards Oliveira to win by decision or maybe a late finish. Next is Anthony Smith versus Jimmy Crute, and to me, these guys are kind of similar in the sense they're both like striker jiu-jitsu guys. I think Crute's probably a little bit more like Crute likes to like do these fast attacks. He likes to get these quick finishes. As where Smith kind of like, he has a lot of first round finishes, but he doesn't have this like super move forward offensive style. It's more like he likes to pick guys at range and he throws solid shots at range. To me, this is tough because I feel like the longer this goes, I do think it favors Smith slightly. It's just those early blitzes from Jimmy are usually really tough to deal with. However, I'm leaning ever so slightly towards Smith. I think that if he can keep this at range, and I think that when it's on the ground, if he can just kind of keep up with Jimmy, especially in the first, I think the longer this goes, the more it's going to favor Smith. And I think eventually he's going to start picking at him with his shots. And I think in rounds 2 or 3, we're going to see Smith eventually get a finish. I think it's the first round that's the most dangerous. And I think that's the round where Jimmy has a strong chance of finishing Smith. But like I said, I'm leaning towards Smith surviving that and then just starting to slowly take over in rounds 2 and 3. And either winning a 29-28 decision or getting like a late finish in one of the rounds, like 2 or 3. Like I said, I'm leaning towards Smith. Next is Uriah Hall versus Chris Weidman, and this is the honest truth. I think Chris Weidman, overall skill-wise, his skills haven't diminished that much. It's just his chin. And this is the honest truth. I don't think Uriah Hall is the greatest chin of all time either. He's been knocked out about the same amount of times as Weidman has. The biggest difference is I think Weidman's got a huge advantage in the grappling, and I think in terms of his overall striking activity. Uriah Hall can one-shot knock him out at any point in time, but like I said, he doesn't throw a hell of a lot, Uriah Hall. That's always been his biggest weakness is that he doesn't have a lot of volume. And I think as long as Weidman is active and careful, especially if he uses his grappling, I think he can win this fight by, TKO or submission in the first 2 rounds. Like I said, I just think he has a big advantage wrestling, and I think he has a big advantage in his overall activity on the feet and on the ground. Because of that, it's hard for me to pick Hall because Hall just, even though he's gone 4-1 in his last 5, he hasn't looked super amazing in a lot of those fights. In pretty much all those fights, they were pretty close, or, he just got a late finish. Like the Bevon Lewis fight, he was down 2 rounds and got late KO. His fight against Christoph Jocko, he's getting his ass kicked until he knocked him out. Same thing with Uriah Hall. He was losing. The Anderson Silva fight. It's so hard to pick Hall because he's just not active enough, and he tends to either be losing fights or, lose fights altogether. So I'm leaning towards Weidman. I think he's going to get the stick round early and just beat him up and win by TKO or submission the first or second round. Next is Valentina Shevchenko versus Jessica Andrade, and I like Jessica Andrade. I think she's a fun fighter. I just think she's at a massive size disadvantage in this fight. I think Valentina's already one of the biggest flyweights in the division in terms of height and size-wise. I think Andrade, at 15, she was able to bully a lot of chicks, and at 25, I think she still can. I just think she's not going to be able to do it to Shevchenko. I think Shevchenko's just too good. And this is the other thing, is we've already seen Andrade lose to Joanna, and Joanna's basically able to just dance around and pick at her from the outside, and I think Valentina's Joanna, but a better version. You know what I mean? She's got the grappling, and in all honesty, she's just a better kickboxer from the outside. And I think that she's just going to be able to pick Jessica apart for 5 rounds. I don't think she's going to knock her out like she could because she's got such a size advantage and like arm and length and reach advantage that she can hit her with a huge shot. But I just think this is going to be just like the Joanna fight where she just stays on the outside and picks her apart for 5 straight rounds. I don't think Jessica's going to be able to take her down. And I think it's just straight kickboxing. Valentina's too good on the outside and with her foot movement to get caught with anything. So I'm leaning towards Valentina to win by unanimous decision. Next is Zhang Weili versus Rose Namajunas, and to me, this fight is all about the first 2 rounds. I think in the first 2 rounds, Rose can absolutely beat Zhang. I think she's the overall better fighter than almost anybody in those first 2 rounds. I think for Zhang, she just needs to fight like Jessica Andrade did. I think the more pressure you put on Rose, the quicker she gasses. I think Rose does not keep the same pace for 5 rounds. It's mainly 2 rounds. And then after that, she starts to gas really hard. That being said, I am leaning ever so slightly towards Rose. Like I said, I do think she can catch her in the first 2 rounds, and I think she will catch her in the first 2 rounds just because I think Zhang fights kind of wild, and that leaves her open for shit. And I think someone as good as Rose will capitalize on that. I think it's going to be a close fight, and I think that if this gets into round 3, Zhang's pretty much going to win, because I think her conditioning and pace and volume are just going to take her apart. But I'm leaning towards Rose to get a finish in the first 2 rounds. Like I said, I think she's too skilled, and I think Zhang is a little too wild, and I think Rose will catch her with something in those first 2 rounds. Next, finally, is Kamaru Usman versus Jorge Masvidal, and in all honesty, this fight's going to end up the same way as the first time. I am picking Masvidal just because I'm like that. I want Masvidal to win so bad. This is the thing. Even if Usman fights him the way that Masvidal wants to fight him, at any point in time, if Masvidal rocks him, he'll just go back to what the first fight's game plan was. And the funniest thing about this fight is people keep saying that Masvidal has like a full fight camp, and this fight was only announced like 6 or 7 weeks ago. It wasn't like, 3 months ago. It was only like 2 at the most. It was 8 weeks at most. So this is just the honest truth. It's a short notice fight camp again, and I just don't see how Masvidal can get away from him. It's literally probably going to be the same fight again. I'm picking Masvidal just because I hope he wins by KO. And thanks for watching, guys. Please like, subscribe.